Okay, so we've got a lot to dig into today, folks.
Yeah.
You've sent in some really interesting stuff about triggers,
Yeah.
like what sets us off emotionally and how we handle disagreements, especially with all the information overload these days.
Oh, yeah. That's a lot.
So we're going to try to extract some practical insights today from your sources about understanding our triggers, communicating better, and maybe even finding common ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And your sources cover a lot of ground here,
Yeah.
from personal experiences and reflections to, societal trends and even some deep dives into psychological concepts like the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Right.
And then some very practical exercises and techniques for engaging with different points of view.
Yeah, so let's jump right in.
Okay.
One of the sources talks about this idea of moving from safe spaces to trigger spaces. What do you make of that?
Well, I think it's a really interesting shift in perspective. Instead of just trying to avoid anything that might upset us, the trigger space concept sort of invites us to acknowledge that these strong emotions might come up.
Yeah.
And maybe even kind of like embrace that a little bit. Think of it like, stepping into a boxing ring. Or, I don't know, maybe a BDSM dungeon or something, where there's a certain level of consent involved. Like, is it okay if I provoke you a little for the sake of, exploration and growth?
Right, right.
And there's a check-in afterwards, like, how are you feeling?
Yeah.
Did that go too far?
Right, it's about resilience, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. It's not about avoiding discomfort altogether, but it's about learning to handle it.
Yeah, to stay in the ring and take the punches.
Exactly.
Now, one of the sources you sent was really personal.
Yeah.
Someone talking about their own journey from having these really strong beliefs to realizing they might not have all the answers. How does that kind of personal honesty strike you?
Well, what I find really powerful about that kind of vulnerability, is that it reminds us that we all have blind spots. We all have these areas where our knowledge is limited.
Right.
And to be able to recognize that even our most deeply held beliefs, can be challenged.
Yeah.
And that's actually a sign of growth. And to be able to say, maybe I don't have all the answers. Maybe I need to learn more.
Yeah. It takes a lot of humility to get to that point.
Yeah, it does.
And we all know that feeling of getting triggered, right?
Oh, yeah.
And it often comes with anger, whether it's some huge global issue or even just like an online debate where you feel like nobody's listening.
Oh, yeah.
That trust the science kind of reaction when you have a different perspective. How does that whole online echo chamber thing feed into this?
Well, I think the online world can really amplify those feelings.
Right.
When you find these groups of people who agree with you instantly, it feels good.
Yeah, it's validating.
It is, but it doesn't necessarily challenge your thinking or help you understand other perspectives.
Yeah, it's a quick hit.
It is. It's like a quick hit of validation, but it can also trap you in a cycle of just constantly seeking that confirmation.
And when that trigger hits, it can be so physical, right?
Yeah.
Like your heart's racing. You want to jump in and argue.
Yeah.
But there's this idea of mentalizing, taking a step back mentally. How can we use that when we feel that heat rising?
I think, imagine hitting the pause button in your mind.
Yeah.
When you feel that surge of emotion, just try to ask yourself, okay, what am I feeling right now? What might be driving the other person's perspective?
Right.
Create a little space.
A little breathing room.
Exactly. A little breathing room between the feeling and your reaction.
Yeah.
Because that gives you the opportunity to respond in a more thoughtful way.
So it's not just about what the other person says.
Right.
It's about how we interpret it.
Exactly. Your past experiences, your beliefs, all of that shapes how you hear things.
Right.
And so taking ownership of your own emotional response is huge.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really empowering.
Now, your sources also talked about different debate styles.
Yeah.
Some people listen carefully before speaking. Others just jump right in.
Right.
How can understanding these different styles help us have better conversations?
I think recognizing these tendencies in ourselves and others can make a big difference.
Right.
If you're someone who tends to listen more, try to find those moments to share your perspective. And if you're someone who's quick to engage, make a conscious effort to really hear what others are saying.
Yeah.
It's about finding that balance,
right.
in the exchange.
And one suggestion to encourage more open dialogue was to start sentences with, I believe, rather than stating things as facts.
Yeah.
And to ask, what do you believe? That seems to tie into this Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah.
You know, where people who know very little can be super confident.
Right.
How do you see those ideas connecting?
Well, I think starting with "I believe" opens the door for nuance, you know?
Yeah.
It acknowledges that a lot of things aren't black and white.
Right.
And the Dunning-Kruger effect is a good reminder that sometimes the people who shout the loudest or are the most certain might actually have the least knowledge,
Right.
while the people who really know their stuff might be a little more hesitant to claim absolute certainty.
Right, right.
So the key is to stay curious, seek feedback, and be open to learning.
Yeah, be humble.
Exactly.
Now, there was also this concept of holding space for different viewpoints, even the ones that seem kind of out there.
Right.
This idea that the road to wisdom is paved with nonsense. What's the value in that?
Well, I think sometimes truly innovative ideas, you know, they start as something that seems unconventional,
Right.
or even a little bit silly. And holding space means creating an environment where a range of ideas can be explored without immediate dismissal. You know, it allows for these unexpected connections and insights to emerge.
You know, one of the sources had this great anecdote about this moment of frustration where they realized, okay, I actually don't know everything either, but I've read a lot.
Yeah.
Which highlights that there's a big difference between reading about something and truly knowing it.
That's such a powerful realization, especially in today's world, you know, where information is so readily available.
Oh, yeah.
But not always reliable.
Right.
And so questioning the certainty of your sources, especially online platforms, I think is absolutely crucial.
Which brings us to this whole idea of critical thinking. You know, like Socrates questioning assumptions constantly.
Right.
And then on top of that, we've got AI now, you know, creating this really realistic content.
Yeah, it's wild.
What are the implications of all this for how we process information?
Well, I think AI makes it even harder to discern what's real and what's not.
Right.
You know, these filters that we've become accustomed to online are now evolving into these AI-generated realities.
It's crazy.
It is, and I think it makes genuine human connection, you know, with all of its messy imperfections, even more valuable.
Absolutely. So revisiting this trigger chamber idea, it's about seeing it as a safe space to work through those feelings, right? Where the back and forth isn't personal.
Right.
And this idea of love and reconciliation and disagreements. That comes down to being willing to let go of our sacred cows.
Exactly. I think meeting in the middle often requires being honest about our own doubts and acknowledging that we might not have all the answers. And there's a real freedom in that shared uncertainty.
I love that finally there's this idea of having a Kirpus persona. This kind of playful challenger who asks questions. And this emphasis on aftercare after intense discussion. They both point to the human element in all this.
They do. I think ultimately it's about recognizing the emotional layer of how we process information.
Right.
And how we engage with each other, you know. Kirpus encourages us to stay curious and challenge assumptions. And aftercare reminds us to tend to our relationships and our own well-being after navigating these difficult conversations.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that understanding our triggers, communicating openly, and being willing to acknowledge what we don't know, those are more important than ever.
I agree.
Especially in this world that's just overflowing with information. So it makes you wonder, right? How can you bring more of that curiosity and humility into your own conversations today?
That's a great question to ponder.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you then. Bye.